Hello YouTube! So today we are going to be talking about the is-ought gap, specifically an attempt by Sam Harris to overcome or refute the is-ought gap. He made an argument on Twitter, I believe. I think that was where he originally made this argument, where he tried to show that actually you can get an ought from an is. And I mean, I think it's fair to say both of us, we're not really that keen on Sam Harris. He kind of sucks at the philosophy stuff, and this is just this is one example of why he sucks at it. And I think
it's bad philosophy. It's not philosophy. I suggested we talk about this because it's a prime example of somebody trying to do philosophy without doing philosophy. They want to engage with the game and they want to be able to make these bold claims, but they don't want to do the hard work of actually studying and learning philosophy. So I thought this was also a great opportunity to talk about epistemic responsibility and the nature of claims and, to a degree, the structure of logic itself.
Yeah. So. And I mean, certainly something that I know we both wanted to make clear is, look, we have done videos before where we do these text analysis things, where we kind of break down the arguments and try to present what these philosophers are talking about. We're going to be sort of doing a similar thing here, but Sam Harris is... This is something a bit different insofar as whatever the problems may have been in those other pieces of text, they were still engaging with the discipline in accordance with certain basic standards of reasoning, which Harris just fails to meet completely, right? Like this, well, I think as I sometimes like to put it, it's not exactly bad philosophy, it's barely even philosophy at all. And
well, I mean, it certainly discusses philosophic topics.
It does, but
it doesn't use, just like you can discuss scientific topics without using the scientific method, this discusses philosophic topics without using anything resembling our methodology or toolkit.
Yeah, it's maybe analogous. I mean, maybe this is a bit too harsh, but I'm inclined to see it as kind of analogous to creationists talking about biology. It's just somebody, yes, they're sort of talking about the biological facts in a broad sense, but they're failing to engage with the subject. Does that make sense?
It does. So I think this is a good time, if you'd like to, just briefly before we actually get started with his argument and what the is-ought gap is, to address why we're saying these horrible things about Sam Harris. We have a quote available. I don't know if you want to pull that up.
Yeah.
But in his book, The Moral Landscape, Sam Harris says, "Many critics fault me for not engaging more directly with the academic literature on moral philosophy. There are two reasons why I haven't done this. First, while I have read a fair amount of this literature, I did not arrive at my position on the relationship between human values and the rest of human knowledge by reading the work of moral philosophers. Semicolon. I came to it by considering the logical implications of our making continued progress in the sciences of mind." And I'm not sure what that says exactly. I don't know how to unpack that.
That's very unclear, isn't it?
But it's the next bit that I'd really like to get to. He says, "Second, I am convinced that every appearance of terms like metaethics, deontology, non-cognitivism, anti-realism, emotivism, etc. directly increases the amount of boredom in the universe." So, I mean, okay, he's snarky, it's funny. Maybe he thinks that ridicule of, people's tastes or using his own tastes is a good way to go about critiquing an entire field of study that he has decided to help himself to and declare himself like the winner of. But it's not. This man explicitly says that he is not going to engage with philosophy whilst trying to do philosophy. The reason we have these terms around is not to bore people. It's unfortunate that he's bored by them. We have these terms because we have worked for centuries to try to understand what is going on within metaethics or even normative ethics. And it is helpful to distinguish between different ideas, different possibilities. It's helpful to our investigation of the possibility of moral properties, how we might know about them, these sorts of things, to have this vocabulary. The fact that he's bored by them is really lousy evidence for their uselessness or lack of utility. Mm-hmm. But yeah, he does directly state he's not engaging with these subjects. So it's not as though Kane and I are just being ivory tower about this. The man categorically refuses to engage with these subjects that we care deeply about.
Yeah, no, I don't think I'm at all ivory tower, because I think I have a lot of evidence that I am very interested in promoting these ideas to a wide audience. So it's definitely not coming from an ivory tower kind of point of view. It's like, no, Sam Harris is just bad at this. And I think that, look, yes, he's, you know, it's like, on the one hand, if you're being really charitable, you might try to say, well, okay, he's trying to write for a broad audience. You know, you've got to simplify things if you want to get that kind of popular interest. But that's not all he's doing. I mean, he is quite explicit about the fact that he's just not interested in actually engaging with the scholarly literature on this stuff. I mean, it's kind of like if you pick up a book on, you know, popular science, say, like that introduces epigenetics to people who aren't biologists. I mean, yes, there may be some simplifications, but they're not going to be like, you know, any occurrences of terms like DNA methylation directly increase the amount of boredom in the universe, right? I mean, and would you take somebody seriously if they said that? No. But unfortunately, there are a lot of people who take Harris quite seriously, and his views, his reasoning is, I think, very deeply confused. I think people will be worse off if they get their views of ethics and meta-ethics from Harris, worse off insofar as they're just going to be they're going to be led into some fairly deep misunderstandings and confusions. So we wanted to do a little bit to correct that.
And we love Hume, and the Izzat gap is not easily defeated. It's certainly not easily defeated by someone who refuses to even properly engage with it. The reason we're not trying to make our lives harder for no reason and have all this crazy jargon, right? It's best practices, and you know, we want to take seriously the philosophers we engage with. But I kind of quit myself of that desire with regard to Harris, because he's made very clear that he doesn't take us seriously. So I'm excited to do this.
All right. Well,
we should probably explain, because we're both like popular philosophers who want to, you know, invite people into the discourse, what the Izzat gap is.
I was just going to say, it's probably time to get onto that. So, I mean, who wants to do that? Do you have a preference?
You know, I have Hume's explanation of it.
Have you got that like on you right here?
Oh, I've got it. Well, not on me, because it's non-physical. But yes. So, and this is again.
I thought you meant that you had it tattooed on your like arm or something.
That would make sense. I do have several of those. No, I have it pulled up ready if you'd like. It's just one paragraph, and we can give some examples and talk a little about what this means.
Yeah.
To quote, "In every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, I have always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary way of reasoning and establishes the being of a god or makes observations concerning human affairs." I really am excited to read this, because Harris does exactly this. "When, of a sudden, I am surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected to an ought or an ought not. This change is imperceptible, but is, however, of the last consequence." Sorry, that was strange. "For, as this ought or ought not express some new relation or affirmation, 'tis necessary that it should be observed and explained, and at the same time that a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be a deduction from others which are entirely different from it. Sorry, that was a bad reading of it, but
well, it got the words out.
It says, yeah, I stumbled through it. I probably should have read it before we started this, but I was too busy eating breakfast, so my apologies. Anyway, no, it's got everything you need in there, but that is really dense. So let's do what Harris refuses to do and actually unpack that in a way that's meaningful.
I'm bringing up my document here so I can write some stuff down, because I think we want to write down some examples of this, of what Hume's getting at.
So what's he saying there? He's saying that, you come across an argument or a claim or something in nature, and it seems like the kinds of arguments and claims we encounter, right? If A, then B, A, therefore B. It's got the look of it. It seems right. But they've smuggled in something with normative force. They've smuggled in an ought somewhere into their reasoning. So that's still a little complex. So I think examples would really help.
So what I've done here is just I've got a little, I'm going to type out a little argument. I'll just go with the example that I use first, and I think we can go through a few examples if that's helpful. A simple way that somebody might reason is to say, okay, if you hit Frank in the face, then Frank will feel pain. So you ought not to hit Frank in the face.
Don't hit Frank.
Right, don't hit Frank. You ought not to hit Frank. Now, the point is this. Maybe that seems to some people very plausible. Okay, fair enough. But the point that Hume is making is that premise that if you hit Frank in the face, then Frank will feel pain, that simply doesn't entail the conclusion that you ought not to hit Frank. In order to get that conclusion, you need to add something like you ought not to do things that cause pain, or something like that. If you add that premise, then yes, you get the conclusion that you ought not to hit Frank in the face. But it doesn't matter how many purely descriptive premises you add. So no matter what you say about the way the world actually is, that's not going to get you any conclusion about how it ought to be. And this is just a point about logical arguments, right? You don't get more out of a logical argument than what you put in it. So if you want to get a conclusion about how things ought to be, there's going to have to be an ought claim in the somewhere in the premises. And so, I don't know, maybe that's a fairly artificial example.
I would like to talk about that one for a minute, because the sneaky trick here is that first premise, if you hit Frank in the face, then Frank will feel pain. That's purely descriptive. It's purely factual. You would have a very hard time arguing with that. Mm-hmm. If you bypass making explicit that second premise and just come immediately to the conclusion, so you ought not hit Frank in the face. Did you specify where we hit Frank?
Yeah.
Okay. Then we ought not hit Frank in the face. It seems very hard to attack that argument, right? Because what you have is a single premise that is descriptively pretty obviously true.
Right.
So it's not clear how to attack this argument. You have to make that second premise explicit.
Yeah, and more than that, I think that part of why that does come across as such a good argument is because basically everybody does accept, just intuitively, something like, yeah, of course you ought not to do things that cause pain. So you can kind of give that argument and bypass actually explicitly stating that premise. But obviously, look, just looking at this from a purely logical point of view, right, I could have a premise that actually you ought to do things that cause pain, right? And obviously, if I was to add that premise, so if I have an argument that says, if you hit Frank in the face, then Frank will feel pain. Premise 2, you ought to do things that cause pain. Then actually the conclusion you get is you ought to hit Frank in the face. And I mean, again, you can say, well, that's ridiculous. Of course, it's not true that you ought to do things that cause pain. But the point is I think that does make it clear that, yeah, when we derive this conclusion that you ought not to hit Frank in the face, you actually are relying on a normative premise. You're relying on a premise which says something about how you ought to act.
What you should do.
Yeah. That's, I think, Hume's point.
And I think any good reasoner, if you put in front of them and make explicit that second premise, they will identify that as the one that you need to argue with, the one that you need to reject, right? So it would be insane to reject the first premise. If you hit Frank in the face, then Frank will feel pain, assuming that, pain exists.
Yeah.
So, there's kind of an assumption there, but because it's simply descriptively true. It's that second premise you'd want to go off after. We ought not do things that cause pain. And I can think of a lot more reasonable ways we could go after that premise, right? I can think of physicians who are trying to help a patient. I can think of a parent, maybe who's taking something away from a child that makes them feel pain, not physical pain, but like as a means of punishment. I can think about me giving very fair grades that are not good to students who perform poorly in my class, and that causes a kind of pain. So it's not clear at all that second premise is very strong.
Yes,
right? We have lots of good reasons for rejecting that premise. And then we're left again with our first premise and this conclusion that comes out of the ether. So that's the is-ought gap. I can give another example if you want me to.
We might as well. Let's do it. Shall I write this down as well?
You can if you want to.
Okay.
I usually prefer to give a more neutral example to my students. So I rode motorcycles for years. So I constructed the following example. Riding motorcycles is very dangerous. Premise 1. Conclusion, therefore, you should not ride motorcycles. That one should be pretty obvious, right? Now we can see I've left something out.
Yeah.
We ought not do things that are dangerous. And now maybe some of us will agree that we ought not do things that are dangerous, but a lot of us are going to push back on that, right? And we're going to immediately recognize with that example that is where you push back. You think, well, no, there are loads of things I do that are dangerous, right? Driving cars is also dangerous, right? Now we have this rich, robust argument. Because it's a lot harder to get a strong ought premise than it is a strong is premise. So it's possible at all.
I guess the general point then is, look, anytime you have a conclusion which says something about what you ought to do, there's got to be an ought somewhere in the premises. And actually, additionally, I think another point that's been raised here is that conclusion, that premise about what you ought to do is going to be where the argument is. That's where all the action is. The claim that you ought not to do things that are dangerous. That's really the part that we're going to be debating, right, if we're doing philosophy. I think that's the is-ought gap, right? Just generally.
I think it is. I really briefly want to say the is-ought gap is not something philosophers routinely walk around trying to close. No. This is not like a hole that we're trying to stitch up. I saw it referred to earlier today as Hume's law, and maybe it would be better if we just called it that, because is-ought gap makes it sound like this is something we need to bridge that needs to be fixed. But I've never conceived of it that way. It is, as I understand it, this really interesting observation about argumentation, about logic, and about entailments.
Yes. I certainly wanted to note, I think that from what I've read of Harris, I think he has some misunderstandings about what this is-ought gap is actually saying, because there are times when he almost seems to assume that if you accept the is-ought gap, then you have to be a moral anti-realist. You have to say that there are no moral truths, there are no moral facts. And I mean, look, we can certainly debate about the status of moral realism, but if you're a moral realist, you should accept the is-ought gap, right? Like, everybody should accept the is-ought gap, because it's just obviously uncontroversially true. So the point that you can't get an ought from an is, that you can't get a conclusion about oughts from premises that do not say anything about oughts, that's really just a point about how logic works. And in the same way as you can't derive an ought from an is, you also, for instance, can't derive claims about philosophers from premises that do not mention anything about philosophers. So I have an example here which hopefully will make this clear. Let's say I say, premise 1, all men are mortal. Okay, so that's my premise, all men are mortal. And now let's suppose I conclude, okay, therefore all philosophers are mortal. Well, look, that's clearly invalid, right? Because what if there are philosophers who aren't men? What if there are some fish who are philosophers or something like that? I've got a premise here.
You have a woman philosopher right here, and you're just like, nah. Fish.
Men, I'm using it in the broad sense, rights of man.
I'm fucking with you. It's okay.
But serious point, right? So, all men are mortal. You don't get the conclusion that all philosophers are mortal, and you can add however many premises you like, right? So let's say I say, okay, all men are mortal. All scholars are men. So we've got premise 1, all men are mortal. Premise 2, all scholars are men. Conclusion, all philosophers are mortal. Again, it just doesn't follow. It's logically invalid. In order to get the conclusion about philosophers, you need to add a premise about philosophers. Something like, for instance, all philosophers are scholars. And then, hang on a minute, I have a typo
now
here.
We've got it.
Now, look, this is a good argument, right? We've got all men are mortal, all scholars are men, all philosophers are scholars, so all scholars are mortal. That works. That's valid. So yeah, in general, if you have a conclusion about something, about X, then you need X in the premises. And this is totally uncontroversial. And it's not necessarily a threat to moral realism. So look, a moral realist should just say, okay, yes, to get a conclusion about oughts and shoulds, you need oughts and shoulds in the premises, but there are some claims about oughts and shoulds that are true. In the same way, to get a conclusion about philosophers, you need philosophers in the premises, but some claims about philosophers are true. So this is ought gap, as you say, it's a point about reasoning, it's a point about logic, and it's very odd that somebody would try to bridge it, it's odd that somebody would feel the need to do that once they understand what it actually is.
Yeah, it's not a thing to be done.
I mean, okay, I suppose I should just add, you can actually find professional philosophers who've attempted to bridge it, but that's just because philosophers will try to do absolutely everything they can, right? You can find a philosopher trying to defend any ridiculous position. So, just make that caveat known.
Yeah. We have paradoxes that we try to solve. We like puzzles. It's what we do, and that is absolutely fine, but I don't think most people view the is-ought gap as a problem that needs solving.
No, I agree.
Most of us just view it as this fun fact about logic and about reasoning. I suppose Hume, when he introduced it, kind of put people on guard in a accept my challenge way, where he observed that people did do this sneaky thing, and then said they needed to stop smuggling in those ought premises in the way he had observed. So maybe that could provide some incentive to try to respond back or close the gap. But as I understand it, and as most people I understand it, think of it, it's not a problem. This is not... It's not a thing. Okay, that's all I have to say about that. I'm very flustered.
Are you? Are you all right? You?
Oh, I'm great. It's just I'm trying to not say anything terrible about Sam Harris, and it's very difficult.
Well,
I'm also really genuinely excited about things like the is-ought gap, right? Because this whole time we've been talking about deductive reasoning, and one of my favorite things to tell my 100 level entry students is that, you know, a big difference between inductive and deductive reasoning is you don't get anything new out of deductive reasoning. It's just a rearrangement of the parts.
Yeah.
Right? From all your premises, be they, you know, 2 or 20, whatever your conclusion is, it has to be some rearrangement of those parts. And that's all Kane and I are really asserting right now, is if you don't have an ought part in there to rearrange, you cannot just randomly introduce it in the conclusion. That will always be invalid.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's there it is.
That's the point. That's a good way to put it. So I think that's basically the is-ought gap. And
so let's watch this guy try to shut on Twitter.
So I guess, I mean, do you want? So should we turn to Harris's argument then, that we found on Twitter?
Okay, so I think you should read his argument because you can have it up on your screen.
Do you want me to just read through the whole thing?
Yeah, let's go through the whole thing. Maybe even copy paste it into your Word document.
It is in there. Yeah.
Okay.
I opened up a Word document with the argument
right next to it. Yeah, you did.
Okay. Right then, let's take a look at Harris's argument from Twitter. So this is what Harris says, and look, I'll just read through it, and then we'll talk about it. So, first premise: let's assume that there are no oughts or shoulds in this universe. There is only what is, the totality of actual and possible facts. Premise 2, among the myriad things that exist are conscious minds, susceptible to a vast range of actual and possible experiences. Premise 3, unfortunately, many experiences suck. And they don't just suck as a matter of cultural convention or personal bias, they really and truly suck. If you doubt this, place your hand on a hot stove and report back. Premise 4, conscious minds are natural phenomena. Consequently, if we were to learn everything there is to know about physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, economics, etc., we would know everything there is to know about making our corner of the universe suck less. Premise 5, if we should do anything in this life, we should avoid what really and truly sucks. If you consider this question begging, consult your stove. Premise 6, of course we can be mistaken about experience. Something can suck for a while only to reveal new experiences which don't suck at all. On these occasions we say, at first that sucked but it was worth it. Premise 7, we can also be selfish and short-sighted. Many solutions to our problems are zero-sum. My gain will be your loss, but better solutions aren't. By what measure of better? Fewer things suck. So what is morality? What ought sentient beings like ourselves do? Understand how the world works, facts, so that we can avoid what sucks, values. So that's the argument. And yeah. Okay. That's the argument.
It's just such a treasure trove of things to criticize.
Right. I mean, okay, yeah. I'm not sure exactly where you wanted to start with this. I
do think we have a bit we can say about the first premise and what motivates that.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm not sure exactly what you're getting at there.
It's a bit for someone who tries to be as colloquial as saying things suck in their formalized version of their argument. This one is surprisingly difficult to understand. So I'd like to just unpack premise 1 a bit. And maybe talk about what motivates it and what he's trying to do here with this first premise of let's assume that there are no oughts or shoulds in this universe. Mm-hmm. That there's only what is, the totality of actual and possible facts. That's already kind of problematic, but he's setting the stage for the is-ought gap and his attempt to explain it. by saying there are no oughts, so all his premises will then be statements of fact only, that he's going to try to derive an ought from. Additionally, what he's excluding here are moral facts. That is what's being left out of his account of the universe. He's effectively, this says, let's assume that there are no moral facts.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah, that's how I interpret it. So I think that's reasonable. I mean, I do want to say about this premise, and I don't know if I mean, I'm conscious of other things that we sort of want to talk about this argument, but it is, I think, a very important point that this argument is just not very well constructed from a purely formal point of view. So he starts... Yeah,
there's one assumption we're allowed to make at the beginning of an argument, and this isn't it.
So Harris starts off by saying, okay, let's assume there are no oughts or shoulds in the universe. Now, bear in mind what he's trying to do here, right? He's trying to get to the conclusion that there are oughts and shoulds. I mean, that's his goal, right? He's trying to... I mean, ultimately, he wants to be a moral realist, and he wants to suggest that, no, you can get from an is to an ought, so there are oughts. So this is a bit of an odd way to start, by saying, you know, well, let's assume there are no oughts or shoulds in this universe. There is a form of argument which is known as a reductio argument, where you begin the argument by assuming... the reductio ad absurdum argument, where you begin the argument by assuming the denial of what it is you want to prove, right? So a classic example of this is Galileo. He had an argument on the Aristotelian view that Galileo was responding to. There was the belief that heavier objects fall faster, and Galileo was wanting to criticize this. And so he says, okay, suppose that heavier objects fall faster. So he makes an assumption that is contrary to what he wants to prove. So he says, suppose it's true that heavier objects fall faster. He says, well, okay, now take two balls, A and B, right, where A is heavier than B. What happens if we connect A and B with a string? Well, B is lighter than A, right? So if heavier objects fall faster, B should retard the falling of A, and so the combination A and B will go slower than A alone. But wait a minute, the combination of A and B is heavier than A alone. So the combination of A and B should fall faster than A alone. So from this assumption that heavier objects fall faster, we've derived the claim that A and B will be slower than A alone, and that A and B will fall faster than A alone, which is contradictory. So
this is where the name comes in, because we have reduced it to the absurd, which means a contradiction.
So Galileo will conclude, okay, this assumption that heavier objects fall faster, that's wrong, right? Objects, no matter what their mass, fall at the same rate. So that's an example of this type of argument, right, where we assume the contrary of what we want to prove. And when I first saw this, when I looked at this, and I saw that Harris starts out with, let's assume there are no oughts or shoulds in the universe, I was like, oh, okay, he's going to give a reductio. He's going to show that something contradictory or something absurd follows from this assumption. And I think the thing to pay attention to as we go through this is he actually doesn't do that. He just starts off with this assumption and then, like, gives it up. He just leaves it. I mean, it's really strange.
There are rules for proofing, right? So, I mean, if you're using a natural system of deduction, it is a legitimate move to add the opposite as a premise. That is a legitimate move. And the note you make, the notation that explains why you were able to add that premise or have that premise is for reductio. You're saying, I will show that this derives a contradiction. That is the only time you get to say, let's assume. Anyone familiar with proofing will be familiar with this. You can't just throw in premises like that. You just don't get to do that.
Yeah. So
also, Also, that was a great example. I did not know that story about Galileo, so you taught me something today. I love that. I will be using it.
Yeah, okay, yeah, it's a good example of that kind of argument, I think, and it's also a good thing to contrast with Harris's argument, because if you just think about the formal structure of, like, I don't get what Harris is doing with that assumption. I mean, I'm just not sure. Like, it seems like he introduces it and then just gives it up when he wants to have the ought claim.
So I think this might be an American thing, and maybe viewers can tell us this. But I remember very early days, in my education, the principle of charitability, as I was taught it, kind of took the form of, like, you grant somebody's first premise, just to let the argument get off the ground. And I'm wondering if, I know he went to a community college for philosophy or something like that. I'm wondering if maybe he wasn't exposed to some similar articulation and is like, haha, I get a freebie.
Well, but it's an odd, yeah, maybe it's just an odd one to start off with. It's still
weird.
Yeah, because ultimately Harris wants to say that, like, there are oughts in the universe, right? I mean, that's he's
it doesn't how it's a bad strategy.
But yeah, so this is just a point that, look, if you're looking at it from a formal point of view, like, you know, from the point of view of logical analysis, the argument is quite poorly constructed. And there's also, I mean, and again, I guess we might talk about this later, but there are also, I don't think that premises 6 and 7 are really doing anything in the argument. It seems to have some superfluous stuff in there.
I think he's trying to cover his butt.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say about that.
6 and 7. I think, wow, we just kind of already did some work with premise 1. I don't have anything in particular to say. I have no problem with premise 2. Among the myriad things that exist are conscious minds susceptible to a vast range of actual and possible experiences. I mean, maybe it's worth noting, not everybody agrees. There are plenty of philosophers who would challenge exist. Kane is one of them. What does it mean they exist? And there are plenty of philosophers who would challenge the existence of conscious minds. But I think this is what maybe Harris was talking about when he said, I'm just not going to engage with silly philosophy. And I'm fine with not engaging with those things here. Like, okay, I'm willing to grant that the myriad of things that exist includes conscious minds.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. At the end of the day, you do have to make some assumptions, right? And like, the claim that there are conscious minds that are susceptible to a vast range of experiences is it's a pretty commonsensical assumption, isn't it? I'm cool with that. Cool, yeah. Harris, you got one. Okay, and so premise 3. Unfortunately, many experiences suck, and they don't just suck as a matter of cultural convention or personal bias. They really and truly suck.
I like how he threatens us into that one.
Sorry?
I like how he threatens us into agreeing with him.
Oh, yeah. Like, if you doubt this, put your hand on a hot stove and report back. So I know that we both have a lot of problems with this particular premise, and I think that it's... I mean, it looks like this is the place where he's smuggling in, or at least this is possibly a place where he's smuggling in an ought claim, right? So, okay, let's start with the first part of this. Many experiences suck. I mean, if you just interpret that purely descriptively, it's like, yeah, fair enough. If I put my hand on a hot stove, I feel pain. I don't like that. So I would say that that's bad for me, right? Like, it's a bad experience for me. But then what Harris goes on to say is, okay, look, this isn't just a matter of cultural convention or personal bias. These experiences really and truly suck. And that's a bit more problematic, right? Because what he wants to do is so if you say that something sucks for me, there's an experience that sucks for me, fair enough. But to say that some experience really and truly sucks, that, like, it's a fact that it sucks in general, that's a bit more of that's a stronger claim.
When he's trying to get out ahead of that by his parenthetic statement of, if you doubt this, place your hand on a hot stove and report back. But instead of actually getting ahead of it, he just ignores the fact that what this claim really is it's that sneaky, you shouldn't do dangerous things, you shouldn't do things that cause pain premise snuck into an otherwise descriptive argument.
Yeah, the assumption here is going to be, okay,
you shouldn't do things that suck.
Do things that suck, right? But I mean, I think maybe one way to really see the problem here is to ask this question. Okay, wait a minute. Sucks for who, or sucks for what, right? When I put my hand on the hot stove, that certainly sucks for me. But maybe it doesn't suck for somebody who enjoys Schadenfreude and enjoys seeing somebody, put their hand on us. Like, imagine me being like, I'm going to refute Sam Harris by putting my hand on a hot stove. That might be quite amusing for some people to see. So, where is...
Well, I think that's what he's trying to do with the premise 6 and premise 7, right? We can be selfish and short-sighted. Many solutions to our problems are zero-sum. My gain will be your loss. But I want to address that doesn't do the work he wants it to do, because because of this reliance on better, which is also, something with normative force. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your rant about Schadenfreude. I just wanted to say, he is aware of that objection. He just tries to sidestep it unsuccessfully.
Yeah, I think actually you might be right about that. That makes much more sense of what premise 7 is doing in that argument. That wasn't immediately obvious, but I think you might be right. Yeah. But yeah, look, the issue here is...
There are also things that I wanted to bring these up. So the example of a hot stove is fine, whatever. Okay, so most people dislike that. I mean, I can think of a circumstance in which putting my hand on the hot stove wouldn't suck. The one specifically where I do it and Sam Harris shuts his fucking mouth forever. That would definitely not suck. In fact, that would lean hard into premise 6. Of course, we can be confused or mistaken about experience. Something can suck for a while, only to reveal new experiences which don't suck at all. So, I mean, let's just keep using the same word. Suck it, Sam Harris. Right? If you're going to leave room for things that later produce new, novel, positive experiences, but appear to suck, your threat of go put your hand on a hot stove is going to fail pretty thoroughly because of that. But on top of that, we have... I'm trying to think how to put this. You know what? It's better saved for once we move on.
Okay.
Let it just be... I want to make really clear that, this premise, many experiences suck, is the use of the word suck there it's not problematic because it's informal. That is not the critique. We've been laughing about him posting this on Twitter and that sort of thing. But I want to avoid that being the thrust of our critique. Our attack on this, they suck. They really and truly suck, is that instead of saying are bad, which would have the immediate problem of having some normative force to it, he's replaced it with suck. And I think it's deliberately sneaky. I don't think he's a stupid man. Otherwise, he wouldn't have, stuck premise 6 and 7 in here, anticipating our critique. It's folksy language to cover up sneaking in a value statement, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you're right. If you say many experiences are bad, well, bad obviously is open to lots of interpretations. But if you say something it's really and truly bad, then you're attributing some kind of objective value. And I mean that. So just to be clear about what for me is one of the problems here. It's all right, where are we getting the objective value from exactly?
Well, especially because your first premise says that doesn't exist.
Exactly, right?
So we already have a contradiction.
But I mean, even if you put aside the first premise, where are you getting the objective suckiness from? If there's some particular thing X, I'm perfectly happy to say that it sucks for something. You know, it sucks for me, or sucks. You know, if a deer gets eaten by a bear, I'm happy to say that sucks for the deer. Doesn't suck for the bear. Doesn't suck for me. So where is this idea of something really and truly sucking coming from, and what are you doing with that? Yeah, that's the issue.
Sneaky jerk. Okay. Are we ready to move on?
Yeah, I think so.
Premise 4. Conscious minds are natural phenomena. Consequently, if we were to learn everything there is to know about physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, economics, etc., we would know everything there is to know about making our corner of the universe suck less. So, with the exception of suck less, I don't really have a problem with this. A lot of philosophers would.
Well, I think I have a problem with it insofar as one of the things that Sam Harris tries to do, just like with his moral philosophy, well, you know, you can call it philosophy if you want, but with his moral views in general, is he tries to say, okay, look, we're basing reality on science, right? And I mean, he's explicitly appealing to this here, like physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, economics. He's saying his general program is the attempt to show that we can derive these claims about morality from science. And so he's kind of, I mean, I can understand why he wants to say that, because we put a lot of, science is something that has, what would be the term, like, it's held in high regard, right, epistemically. So yeah, if you can show that moral values are derived from science, then that's like, you sort of inherit the epistemic credentials, I guess, of the sciences.
Oh, is that what you think it is?
Well, I mean, I think that's definitely one of the things he's trying to do. But the problem is that it's like, look, nobody doubts that if you adopt a particular moral standard, right? Let's say that you make the claim that you ought to minimize suffering. Nobody doubts that, yeah, you can apply scientific reasoning to figure out what would minimize suffering. Like there's no controversy. Well, I'd say no controversy. Maybe there's a little bit of controversy, but there's barely any controversy about that, right? Pretty much everybody accepts.
There isn't any is-ought problem there, though, because you've already got the ought in the premise.
Exactly. So, but the question is, okay, what is the basic moral standard? How do we establish it? That is the question. And even on Harris's own view, he does not solve that by appealing to science. I mean, you can't solve that by appealing to science. But Harris himself doesn't solve that by appealing to science. You don't get the claim that it is good to minimize suffering, or it is good to promote well-being. You don't just get that from doing scientific research. Even Harris doesn't, right? That's established beforehand, and then you can apply science, and that's uncontroversial. And I think Harris tries to obfuscate that, and that, I think, is something that should be criticised. Nobody doubts that if you establish a kind of fundamental moral value, then empirical science can kind of help you. It can show you the situations that best exemplify it. But that's not what's at issue here, right? Like,
nor is that. I don't understand why he hasn't chosen to just make his first premise utilitarianism is true, right? Something like that, and then yes, proceed, go on. He assumes utilitarianism throughout all of his work, and I think he wants to say it's logically grounded. But I mean, if we're just talking like pure structural argumentation, a deductive argument that as its first premise says utilitarianism is true, can very easily produce a valid conclusion, all sorts of valid conclusions, whereas what he's constructed here is structurally flawed in such a way that it's never going to work. You're never going to be able to derive anything from this. And I think maybe that kind of speaks to what you were trying to say about the first premise. Like, this is not how we go about constructing a formal argument. I think if he did the honest thing and just assumed utilitarianism, he recognizes that would be weaker, because then people would say, well, hold on, I don't want to assume utilitarianism.
Right.
I have good, cogent, salient objections to utilitarianism. It's problematic. And again, it's just obfuscation.
Yeah, yeah. And that is where all of the argument about moral philosophy actually is, right? That's where that's what normative ethicists are debating, is the status of utilitarianism.
But no, he's not going to talk to us because we make him bored.
Yeah, yeah.
He just wants to be right. He just wants us to grant that. Sorry. I hate this guy. Okay.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, actually, I think there are issues with premise 4, at least in terms of why he's appealing to science. Also, just actually, like another minor point about this is, I mean, if you're talking about stuff like putting your hand on a hot stove, you don't need physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, etc. to tell you what to do there. Like a lot of moral theory, moral reasoning doesn't really necessarily have to appeal to those sciences, but maybe that's not such an important issue. But yeah.
Well, I mean, okay, so seeing as you brought it up, I feel the need to point out that most of the things that we can learn from physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, economics, etc. I mean, maybe I shouldn't say most. I structured that sentence poorly. There are things we can learn about those things that might, in a subjective sense, make our lives suck less. But my mind immediately goes to it's Nozick's experience machine, the thought experiment. Because I mean, theoretically, if I did learn all there is to know about physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, etc., I would be able to construct a box that you could go into that would then allow your brain states to be optimized, right? And yet we shiver and cringe at that. Like, that is not a pleasant or desirable situation for the vast majority of us. And I think that's a really great example of why learning more about these things doesn't necessarily help us to create a more desirable world.
Yeah, and that actually just generally is a great example of kind of moral philosophy in action, and why you can't get away from philosophical arguments, right? Because actually a lot of people have the intuition that getting into something like the experience machine would be a bad idea, and like, why would that be?
According to science, there's no reason it should.
Yeah. So, yeah, you've like there's a debate to be had there, right? Like, you can't just. This is one reason why actually you can't just assume that producing pleasant experiences or whatever is what we should do. There seem to be some compelling arguments against that.
Yeah, and intuitions. Oh. Suck it again, Sam Harris. All right, premise 5. You want to start this one?
Let's go on then. So, yeah, if we should do anything in this life, we should avoid what really and truly sucks. So
that one's pretty obvious at this point.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I feel like. Yeah, the issue here, I don't know what to add to what's already been said. In a way, it's
Well, I think we looked at. I originally found this argument not on Twitter, because I don't like Twitter, and I certainly don't follow Sam Harris, but on Philosophy Cafe, or Cafe Philosophy, which is just a website. I found it through a philosophy teaching forum, and I think the author there points this out really really well. So premise 5, if we should do anything in this life, we should avoid what really and truly sucks, is a conditional. And that conditional is used to deduce a subconclusion that's not stated. And it makes this really apparent. So after premise 5, there should be subconclusion. We should avoid what really and truly sucks, right? So we need to fix premise 5, though, right? Because it's a conditional. If we should do anything in life, we should avoid what really and truly sucks. He's snuck in there the other half of the conditional statement, right?
Yeah. So
I don't know if you can write that in. Do you see what I'm saying?
We should do something in this life.
There it is. Thank you. Sorry, because I don't have your Word document in front of me, it's a bit hard.
There is something we should do. There is something we ought to do.
Ooh, problem. Right? Big problem, because that contradicts his first premise completely. Right? Let's assume there are no oughts or shoulds in this universe. Then we jump to premise 5. We should do things in this life. It's just a immediately apparent contradiction.
Yeah.
I don't know how he continue. You cannot get past that. The first premise says, let's assume these do not exist. The fifth premise necessitates the existence of shoulds in this world. And frankly, logically, there is no way out of that for him. He needs premise 5 too in order to get to his conclusion. Yeah. So he can't just drop that premise. Do you want to explain why? Because it's in front of you. Why he needs premise 5 for his conclusion?
Okay, where are we? So
let's be very thorough.
Yeah, the conclusion is, so what is morality? What ought sentient beings like ourselves do? Understand how the world works, facts, so that we can avoid what sucks. So actually, the conclusion maybe isn't. It's not written in exactly a very formal way, but the conclusion is something like sentient beings like ourselves ought to understand how the world works so that we can avoid what sucks. I mean, there's an assumption that we ought to avoid what sucks. You don't get that without something like premise 5. What do I need to explain here?
I don't know. I just felt like maybe because like it's kind of a ta-da moment or a jazz hands moment, but I really like it feels lackluster by the time we get to it. I want to be really clear that this is a fatal structural flaw for his argument.
Yeah, I mean certainly if the claim is that we are deriving an ought from an is, or we're deriving a should statement from merely descriptive statements. I mean, I hope that it should really be. I don't know. I feel like it's obvious at this point.
Even without the is ought gap. He thinks he's solved the is ought solved. I'm sorry. There's a bug. I say that as though solving it is a thing to do, and I'm kind of mad at myself for that because I don't think it is a thing to do. But if we even set aside that this is supposed to be about deriving an ought from an is, and we forget that Hume has ever, existed, we can still see there is a contradiction in his own argument. We could change it out to X's and Y's, right?
Yeah.
His first premise is assume X does not exist, and then his fifth premise requires X. It's not even about the is ought gap at that point. It's about an internal contradiction in the structure of the argument itself.
Yeah, and well, I guess that was one of the points. This is exactly the thing I guess I was suggesting when I first mentioned the problem with this first premise is he starts with the assumption that there are no oughts or shoulds, and then just introduces that there are oughts and shoulds. He just drops the assumption. doesn't show what's wrong with the assumption. He just gives it up.
For no reason.
Yeah, it's very, very weirdly structured. Yeah, I don't really have anything more to add about that.
I mean, so I don't have anything more to add about the argument. I think we can wash our hands of it at this point.
I mean, the argument in general, actually, so there is one other thing I did want to say. So let's say you just accept everything Harris has said here, right? And so you accept his conclusion, which is something like, we ought to avoid what sucks, and let's even assume that we can kind of nail down some kind of objective sucking, right? Objective suckiness, right?
A suck telescope that identifies.
So we know the stuff that objectively sucks. Even having accepted all of that, what does that tell us about what we ought to do? Well, actually, not much, because there's still a debate about. So the way that this particular debate is sometimes framed by moral philosophers is, you've got a question about what the moral values are, right? But then there's a question about how you act with respect to the moral values. And so one question, for instance, is, well, should you promote values or should you honor values, right? And so somebody who wants to promote the value of not sucking or non-suckiness, that person will just try to act in such a way as to just reduce suckiness, no matter what the context. So this is a kind of consequentialist approach, right? You just perform whatever action will reduce suckiness in the world, even if that means producing a bit of suckiness beforehand. And you know what? I have to change the terminology here, because this is just confusing.
It's so
right.
Weird.
So let's say that you think that killing is bad, right? That ending a life is bad, right? Let's just assume that that's true. Well, it might be the case that in certain circumstances, you can save more lives overall by killing one person, right? So maybe if I, push somebody in front of a tram going down a track, that will save 5 people on the other end of the tram. This is a sort of trolley type problem, right? I kill one person to save 5. I'm promoting the value of preserving life, because I'm preserving more life overall. On the other hand, there's honoring the value, which is, so I make sure in my own actions that I never act so as to end people's lives. So if I'm faced with that situation where I could push someone in front of the tram to save 5, I won't do it, because that will involve killing that one person. So you can accept all of this stuff about values. You still don't get a claim about what you ought to do, because you've still got a further question about how you should act with respect to those values. If you want to promote well-being, how do we how exactly do we kind of put that value into our moral theory, right? Do we just say, okay, you should just act in such a way as to increase well-being for everybody? Or do we say something like, you should act according to a rule such that if everyone were to act according to that rule, that would make everybody have more well-being? Or something else?
No, it's not at all obvious. So I actually go a bit further with my thinking about this, and I love the example of not killing someone. So because there's a really big assumption in there, which is that life is valuable, something like that, right? And death is bad. The death of a human is bad. And, we've got philosophers who argue along these lines and come to the conclusion that the only moral thing to do is stop having children, for example. We eliminate death. We eliminate suckiness in conscious minds. We eliminate all the bad stuff. This is an entirely plausible outcome of this sort of quick and dirty philosophic reasoning. Heck, it's an entirely plausible outcome of any kind of sort of consequentialist reasoning. And those people ultimately are taking that idea of honoring the value you've derived to its zenith, really. So, right? I mean, I think that's what that is. And I'm not an anti-natalist or anything like that, but I think it's pretty obvious how trying to honor or promote these sorts of values leads to situations that aren't at all as easy or clear as not putting your hand on the stove. And that's what moral philosophy is supposed to be for. It's supposed to be for tricky situations. If you're deriving awful outcomes from them, then you should modify your moral philosophy.
I mean, the way that you might put this is there isn't just an is-ought gap. There's also a value-ought gap.
Or a fact value. Oh, no. Okay, so yeah.
Well,
sorry.
There's also that. But
I see what you did there. It was cleverer than what I did.
No, like what you can imagine that there are really these objective values in the world, but they don't in themselves tell you anything about what you ought to do, because you've still got that further claim about how you should act with respect to those values, and that just isn't. It's just not obvious. You know, there are consequentialists who tend to just think in terms of actions are evaluated in terms of their consequences. And I mean, I think Sam Harris is a consequentialist. I mean, he's basically a utilitarian of some sort or something like that. But like, that's not just something you can take for granted. There are very plausible arguments for deontological views, which I think is a word that he said was boring. But the reason why we
can't even consider
so
other normative ethical systems because it's boring.
But deontological theories will tend to say, no, you know, you act according to certain rules, right? You're not just doing whatever you can to bring about more of that value. You know, you're not. You know, the means matter, not just the ends. That's a perfectly plausible position, and Sam Harris just completely ignores that debate. Just just pretends that doesn't even exist. That we can just sort of assume some sort of consequentialism, which is ridiculous.
Well, I mean, because if you let him get away with this argument, then sucking less, trying to make things suck less, is obviously what you should do, right? That's his conclusion, and it's explicitly consequentialist. You should do things that make the universe suck less.
Yeah.
It's explicit. So I guess this doesn't just try to close the is-ought gap. It tries to be a formal argument for some kind of minimal suckiness utilitarianism, whatever that is.
Which actually, as you mentioned, I mean, a minimal suckiness utilitarianism would seem to entail that we should just, like, if you could press a button that would blow up the planet, you should just do it, and end life completely.
Yeah, so if you want to let him get away with this bad argument, it's this sort of ethical system he's created still is subject to all the very good critiques of utilitarianism, which again he just completely dismisses because they're not words that he likes. That's strong reasoning right there. Oh, Sam Harris. I had something. Oh no, what I wanted to say is I have seen Harris well, not like with my eyeballs, although I did attend and speak at several conferences he was at. But I have seen him confronted with some of these problems in podcasts and on YouTube and by Dan Dennett. And I know he is aware of them. We can look at the way he hedges in this argument with premise 6 and 7 and see pretty clearly that people have tried to engage with him about some of the problems we've pointed out today, if not all of the problems we've pointed out today. And his refusal to modify his argument or account for these objections or just outright defeaters for his argument brings me back to what I wanted to say about epistemic responsibility, because that's problematic. What he is doing is not laudable. It is spreading misinformation. It misleads people about what philosophy is. And if anything is demonstrably making things suck more, it's behaving in epistemically irresponsible ways, such as Sam Harris does here and in general.
Yeah. Well, I mean, is that it? Is that what we were going to say? Is that the end of that?
You want to leave it there?
I agree with what you said. I don't know if I have anything to add to that, really. I mean, again, just to be absolutely clear about all of this, we're specifically criticizing Sam Harris's defense of his moral realist position. You can be a moral realist or a utilitarian or whatever in a way that is sophisticated and engages with these arguments.
We both have videos that are digestible to the public about meta-ethics and engage with these topics in ways that he refuses to, for that matter.
No, I mean, I don't know if there's... I'm not sure. I think that's it. I don't know if there's anything we need to say in summary, but yeah, it's bad, what he does. And I don't think there's really much of an excuse at this point, given that he has clearly engaged with actual philosophers numerous times and just sort of refused to take on board good points that have been made to him. I mean, to be fair, okay, we have looked at what was basically a Twitter post.
We looked at I pulled up the moral landscape too, and that is an explicit refusal to engage with these ideas. So,
but I think I look, the moral landscape. We haven't gone through the actual book. I mean, I'm just conscious that some people might look at this and be like, okay, yeah, but that's just a Twitter post. But number one, there are similar serious problems throughout the moral landscape. And actually, number two, I'm not inclined to let people off just on the grounds that, oh, well, it's only Twitter. I mean, he's got, a lot of followers, and it's perfectly possible to write. You can put a, logically valid argument out on Twitter. You can summarize your views in a more simplified way. There are very, very deep misunderstandings, and yeah, just deep problems with what Sam Harris has written here.
And elsewhere. We tried to do the moral landscape. It was just too long and too problematic to make a coherent video of it. It would have taken 20 hours. We would have done 20 hours.
Would suggest as well, also kind of too boring. So by Sam Harris's own reasoning, we are justified in dismissing it completely.
So let's never do this again and make the world suck less by deplatforming this person.
Okay.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.